I'm Nicolai, and I'm very angry with all of you. Because I've been reading your code, and I found no comments there. At all. And it makes me go fucking crazy, right? Because there has been this guy, and he said, all comments are failures. All the time. And it's stupid. It's a stupid thing to say, and he's wrong. I'm going to tell you why. But first, I have to, blow some steam, because it annoys me to no end. So people come, we don't need comments. We have self-documenting code. It's awesome. It has all the best names. And it's totally tested. And it's all solid and great and perfect. And I don't give a shit. I don't care about your code. I want to call a method. I want to know what it does. I want to know whether I can get nullback. I want to know whether it's thread safe or whether your object is immutable. That's what I want to know. I don't want to go in there and change the whole context that I'm building up and do something totally different to understand your special snowflake-like code. I'm in a hurry, I have to get shit done, and I need that information and not looking at a million lines of code. But that's the test, right? The test will tell me what happens. You know what? I care even less about that. It's great that you have tests, and we all should have them, but let's say there is this interface, and I want to find out what I can do with that interface. And you have like 5 implementations, and you have 5 tests for each method. So then I go through all 5 tests for each of the 5 methods, for all of the 5 implementations, and check 125 tests for something that might resemble my use case. That's just wrong. That's just total waste of time. And then you also have trouble with some of the things that I really care about. I want to know whether for all of the things I can do, I get something back. But tests are just examples. And you can't really prove for all with examples. Thread safety? Yeah, sure, you might write tests that cover that, but I guess they're not as readable as a simple sentence would be. And immutability, that's even worse. I mean, it's really hard to test that. I've been told that there's a JUnit plugin that actually does that in a simple line of code, and I hope everybody is using it, because otherwise, how do I find out by your test whether anything is immutable? And also, if you have a test coverage of less than like 90%, then all of this is pretty useless, right? Because I'm always interested in the other 10% that you're not covering in your tests. So did you ever hear, like you go to a new online community and you're like, how does it work? Did anybody ever tell you to read the fucking tests? No? What did they say? What am I thinking about this other thing that you can actually use to document stuff? I don't know. Maybe we can find it later. And then there are always people like saying, no, we hate comments. Comments age, like by themselves. They just rot. And that's just stupid. That's like saying cars crash. I mean, come on, yes they do. And it's horrible. And it's also punishable by law, by the way, in most cases at least. So do we get rid of them? No, we don't. We accept the fact and we try to reduce that there are some problems, but other than that, we still use it. And then you had this thing with the names, right? You had these perfect names. Don't they age too? What kind of stuff is that? You're updating names as you go, package names, class names, method names, you update all of them, and the comments, that doesn't work? You can't look at like one more line of code, one more line in your code base to change? So really, you should just all like comment your fucking code at least to a minimal amount to make people like me less angry and happier. Okay. So, there was a talk, right? I mean, I guess you all agree with me, so we can go home? No? Why not? Come on. Okay, so apparently there are actually some reasons why you would not just go crazy and comment everything in your code base. So let's look over the next couple of minutes at, or the next of this talk, what kind of costs comments have, and what kind of benefits they can have, and what kinds of comments have what kinds of benefits and costs, and whether we actually do not want to use some of them some of the time. So I'm not telling you to have a comment on every line of code. I'm just saying use them judiciously and think about that, and just don't drink the Kool-Aid that every comment is a failure. Okay, let's talk about some of the costs. The most obvious thing is I want to write a comment. It takes time. And it takes more time the later I do it. If I write the code now and comment like 2 days later, it takes more time than if I do it immediately. And if the code is very complex, then it might be hard to write a proper comment for that. I'd say if the abstraction works well, then that's limited this kind of cost, but still it might be there. And if you want to write more than get user returns the user and actually provides some valid information that I can use, then it takes more time, definitely. From my personal point of view, I think if you're writing code that works, and then you're writing code that's beautiful, and then you're writing code that's tested, or if you're doing TDD the other way around, you're investing a lot of time in your code. Adding some comments does not make that considerably more expensive. But then, and this is the critical part, there's maintenance, right? Code changes, and comments need to change as well. And, well, they don't need to change, you can delete them. But so if you change the code, something has to happen. You either update the comments, which takes time, you leave them as they are, which is definitely the worst thing to do, because then it will cause confusion down the road. People just ignore all comments, won't write them, make me angry, so that doesn't work. And you can just delete them. That's a fair choice. It also has a cost, though. It wasted the time that was invested before, and will prevent further benefit from these comments, if they provide any. So, if you don't take too much away from this talk, except the title and one other thing, then it should be that whatever you and your team decide on, if you don't find out how you want to maintain your comments, then just all worth nothing. Because if that doesn't work, then you can find old and aged comments, and then people won't care anymore, and that just, as I said, doesn't work. So let's consider the idea that we actually want to change the comments. That's not that hard. I mean, the user could be null before, now it can't be null anymore, I just add that thing in there. That's not hard. The hard part is finding all the places where something changed. So if my comments are like very all over the place, and I change a detailed implementation, I might be forced to look, I don't know, through the whole class to actually do it properly. Even worse, I might be forced to look through other classes, and that's definitely not something anyone would do. So the first takeaway is, if for maintenance to work at all, we have to have the comment and the code as close enough together as possible. So when I change the code, I immediately see the comment that's related to it. Then there's this other cost that people often put out there. It causes confusion. If a comment is wrong, for whatever reason, it's outdated, or it's just ambiguous, it says something that the author thought was perfectly clear, but it's not, and so I don't know what it means, then it can actually lead to some wrong decisions and to confusion. And they might be lacking detail. If it just says, get user returns the user, then there's no information there. So the thing that I might want to know is not even in there. And the problem with this is, and this is very real, that the costs are unpredictable, but they can be enormous. I mean, it can be really like you're debugging code, you have a lot of things that you don't know very well, you're looking through each of those methods that gets called, you try to find out where it goes wrong, some comment tells you, this is what happens, and you believe it for now because you cannot go depth first search, so you do breadth first search, you try to find the thing that's most likely to go wrong, and the comment deflects you and says like, look, this is how it's happening, but it's not. You may waste like half a day before you find that, yes, actually the bug was in that method, but the comment told you that that the specific thing that went wrong cannot go wrong in there. And this also means that people will not trust the comments anymore. This happens to you once or twice, you'll be like, fuck that shit. I'm not going to read these comments anyway because they're all lying to me. And that is actually a sensible decision if that happens too often. And then there's this one, which I like the most. It takes up screen space. I want to focus on just the code. I don't even take this seriously. I mean, you can fold most of the comments away anyway, and then look at them on demand, like have a mouse over or have a plugin, pop-up or whatever. Most comments at least. Otherwise, I don't know. I use scrolling in the worst when it comes to that. So, while I think that at least the first arguments against comments were true, well, this is more like a fake argument. I think there's an underlying reason why everybody really hates comments. It's because it's hard to do. If you write a proper comment, it takes time. It takes a skill that not developers naturally have, because we're all good at thinking abstractly and in technical terms and tell the compiler what to do. And then even we learned from clean code that we also write the code in a way that tells humans what we mean. But writing like text, English or whatever, you write those comments in fluent text is a slightly different skill. And you might not care about that skill and might not want to learn it. And that's a lot of work for nothing. They don't turn anything green. Nobody's coming by like, I read that comment you wrote yesterday. It's really clever. Like, I appreciate that you did that. That's never going to happen. So all you're going to get is a lot of work and no benefits. Get over it. We do that in other places as well. It's still necessary to have a well-maintained code base. I think there are benefits. Just a small note at the beginning, I also am very convinced that they diminish very quickly. So while there's a lot of benefit in having a small number of judicially placed comments, if you just like comment everything, that you won't get much more. So what do comments do? What does a comment do for me? Why am I so eager to read some comment? Because it might tell me what happens. Well, that's stupid. I mean, I can read the code, right? The code is supposed to tell me what happens. That's what it's doing, telling the compiler and me what happens. And if you write clean code, which I hope you do, I try my best to do it, then usually it doesn't add a lot of information. It's totally redundant. All it can do at worst is just confuse you because it says something different. The only thing that I think might be interesting if you do like some arcane language features. For example, in Java, like the bitwise OR operator, it's used so rarely that it might be interesting to point it out, unless you're doing a lot of bitwise operations. But otherwise, like in a normal library, sometimes you do suddenly you do a bitwise OR, for example. Maybe you want to say that, look, this is a bitwise OR, I not just forgot the second pipe. But otherwise, not that interesting, I think. This is interesting. This, I think, is the major reason why I miss comments. It keeps an abstraction intact. So every unit of code should have an abstraction, right? A class, a package, a method. Everything should do this one thing and do it well. And it should not tell you how it does it. It should just do it without you having to care. You should not be forced to look past that abstraction. I mean, you might know how hashmap is implemented, and that's cool. But if you want to use the map interface, you don't have to know that, and you shouldn't be forced to know that, because that's just a waste of time unless you want to actually deal with the internals. So I think these abstractions are very, very important, and comments help me stay on the level of abstraction that I am, because I'm going through code, I'm trying to guess what happens, I'm trying to write or debug or whatever, and I build this context up in my head. And then I have this boundaries of this context are exactly all of these abstractions around me. I know what a list does, I know what a map does, I know what your API does, I know how we call that Twitter service, I know all of those things. And I want to be able to keep my context somewhat bounded. Like if every line of code that I have to understand in detail, I have to go in and dig, then I have to build a whole new context and learn that, and then come back to the previous one and apply that knowledge. And this just doesn't work too well. This kind of abstractions then get very leaky, and good abstractions are the core to modularizing everything. Like whenever you have a problem, you try to split it up and deal with it one by one, which doesn't work if whenever you look at one piece, you have to go into and look into it. And abstractions actually provide two benefits. What I said now deals a lot with I reuse understanding. You had some understanding of the problem. You fixed you implemented something, fixed a problem, or wrote some code, wrote some feature. And this understanding I can reuse if I look at a comment. I can say like, okay, you know how, I don't know, like tree mapping works, whatever. You know this detail, you did it. And I can reuse that understanding and build on top of it. I can also reuse the code. I can just call into it and it does what I want to. And comments can help with both, and I think this is also one of the reasons why I'm harping against clean code and test, which I think, as I said again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, we should definitely do that, but if I read the clean code and I read the tests, I'm already past that abstraction, I already lost, I'm already in that thing that I only wanted to understand from the outside. So that's really, they only shine when it's too late. So another thing that I appreciate about well-placed comments is the way I understand problems. I think it's different for everyone, but I think many people understand problems more from the top down. So this is my problem, and then I explain like 3 details of that, and then 3 more details of that. And if I want to understand something new, then it makes, for me at least personally, more sense to go that way, as opposed to looking at the tests of each individual implementation and then build it back up. So I think that top-down approach is usually preferable when you want to learn something, which is how every book teaches you things that way. Nobody's going, okay, look, we're talking about Java, this is how bytecode works. This is not what's happening, and it's not happening for a good reason. So you want to have a top-down approach, I think, in most cases for most people, and comments cannot do all that by themselves. You have to have maybe wiki articles, UML diagrams, whatever, but they can help. They can be signposts and be like, okay, this is the class, and I'm dealing with that class over there to achieve this and that might help me stay on one level of abstraction instead of going deeper and going like accidentally go very deep into that abstraction tree before I realize this is just a detail. I don't even want to know about that right now. And this is maybe the only thing that the pure clean code crew agrees, that you want to document intent. Like you look at some code, you're like, why? Like, really, why? Why the fuck is it like this? And this is something that is really, really hard to cover with anything else. So I don't want to have a method name that says, get user but never null because Nicolai complained. That's not a good method name. But because Nicolai complained is the only reason why it never returns null, maybe a comment can tell me that. Or maybe it's because Janice in accounting wanted this feature. Well, then it should be somewhere. It could be in the issue tracker, but that may be too far away. We'll look at that later in details. So as I said, other tools can also help with documenting intent. But working through them takes time. So let's say we make really great commit messages and everything is in there. We have cool issues which explain what we're doing. And that's all nice, and we should have that. But that also means when I'm in the code looking at something and I want to know what happened, why it is like this, then I have to check all these things, which is fine, doing that on a daily basis. I'm not complaining that it's too hard, but it also means that as soon as I got that understanding, I act on it, and then it's gone. Because if you then come into the same place an hour later, you do just the same work. I could just put a one-liner in there that acts as a second line of defense in case the code can't tell you the intent, but all these other systems do. Maybe I can summarize it in like 2 lines and say why it's like this. And this is something that when I first wrote about this, because I started with this rant that I gave in the beginning, and then someone wrote the other post as well. But this is something that somebody else pointed me to. I think that's really cool. I never considered that, but it is true actually. I realized that I'm doing this sometimes. I write a couple of comments, and while I do that, even while I write, for example, we do code reviews, and I want to put in a small description for the code review to tell the reviewer like what's roughly going on. Even then, I realize if I stay on a very, very shallow level, just write some sentences. Sometimes I realize, now that I put it that way, that's stupid. Let's do it differently. If you're documenting something that is very complex and you find out that I have to put like 5 sentences in there to explain this thing, then maybe it's not the best way to write the code. And sometimes you get like stuck mentally in what you're doing and you don't realize it. Writing documentation gives you another perspective, that of the user, and maybe that helps. Okay. Let's look a little bit closer at some of the properties that are interesting for comments. So one is how, I don't know whether that's the best English word, up to dateness is also stupid. So what it means is how up to date do comments have to be. And I talked a little bit about what kind of comments I might read, and I think it's fair to say that some need to be very up to date, but maybe others don't. I mean, Janice in accounting wanted this feature. That is always true. Maybe that's not the only reason why it's there, but it's not that necessary to clean that up. And if it has to be very up-to-date, then you have to spend a lot of time on maintenance, and confusion risk is high. How local do comments have to be? Again, some of them have to be like on the line they're commenting. If I'm doing proper Java doc and I put all the method comments in the head of the class, which nobody does, of course, but if I would do that, that would obviously be a stupid decision because it should be on the method. So it's close to where I can see it when I have to change it. So some must be basically right there, and others, could be like a package, for example, package comment that says like, look, this package is going to do this and that for you. That can be a little bit further removed. So this also plays a role. And generally, of course, it's very hard to update comments that are very far away. And then let's now call it alternatives. In the beginning, I harped about how stupid some of these recommendations are when it comes to replacing comments. But yes, of course, these things, clean code, writing tests and maybe demos even, your version control system, issue trackers, wikis, UML diagrams, all that kind of stuff, are alternatives to comments, but not to all of them in every way. So it makes sense to look at that as well. So what I'm trying to do next is I try to sit down and decide which kind of comments are there really, at least from the point that I see it. Which kind of comments do I usually see in code or miss in code? And so we're going to cover a couple of them and see how they fare when it comes to costs and benefits and alternatives. So the first thing is these kind of comments. Awesome. Like I couldn't have known before. So I call them narrations. Usually these are these kind of inline comments. They explain what the code does, and as I said in the beginning, that's totally redundant, and there's no information in there. And usually you can see that also on a very technical level. So up here, maybe there would have been an interesting way to put this differently, to say why this is interesting here, but they didn't. They just, this is the same thing that is in here, and this is even worse. It even mentions the same name of the variable. So they are usually on a very technical level. And everybody knows these are stupid, right? That's why you all laughed. But let's try to analyze, and let's try whether we can come to this decision on a more scientific basis, to be stretching that word very far. So they have to be very up to date, like all the time. If they're wrong, then they're even more useless than they already are. And they have to be right on the lines that you're going to comment. And as I said, there are alternatives, and these, I think, are the alternatives for these kind of comments. And they work really well. Like if you're just a good name, then it's just as good as a comment. Using transparent design, like using solid, or using well-known patterns, not using some arcane stuff, like doing just like, this is a normal visitor pattern, everybody sees that and knows, what to expect. Okay, what about the costs? Like writing them is really not that hard, right? I mean, if you write a lot of them, it takes a lot of time, but otherwise it's really easy. You just basically repeat the source code in your own words. High maintenance, high confusion risk, and usually they can't be hidden. So they suck on all of these points. And what about the benefits? Do they at least provide any benefit? I mean, yeah, they explain what happens, but as I said, we might already know that. So we can see that they have high costs, no benefits, they suck, and maybe this is the framework that we put up to judge comments. Maybe it's not that stupid. So I would say no, don't use them ever, unless, as I said, you use something strange where there's no alternative to, and you cannot make the code nicer. Then maybe a comment works. Okay, so what does it do? That's covered by the narrations, and we shouldn't care too much. But what does it promise? Okay, I guess everybody knows this method. Like screaming, what does it do? Return size, okay. Well, what is the size of a map? Number of elements. Number of key value mappings in this map. There are dots left. What could it be? Okay, I didn't know. I just picked this example, but I didn't know before. It returns an int. What if a map is really big? Like really big. If the map contains more elements, then okay, cool. Didn't know that. I like it. I call these contract comments or contracts because they actually define a contract. They are saying what is supposed to be true about this code. And this is usually Java doc on classes and methods. And they do a lot of things. They explain what is the central abstraction of this method, and what are the pre and post conditions, and what kind of things you might not expect, and talk about and tell you about those. And I think when we look at that, they also have to be very up to date, right? If you have Javadoc that promises something different, then it just sucks. Then you go doing, that's exactly what I said earlier, this kind of confusion. When I look at the, if for example, the map method would say, I return 0 if it's more objects, more key value mappings, and it doesn't return 0, then my whole assumption might be wrong, and I might be missing the bug that I'm looking for. They also have to be very local, usually right on the method or class. And I think good names and tests can be an alternative, but only in a limited kind of way. You cannot push all this information about pre and post conditions and quirks and everything into that one method. I mean, what was it sound like? Size unless map too large, then int max value? That doesn't make sense. So names obviously struggle with that. And yes, there can be tests. There should be a test for that, definitely. But it might not be that easy to find, especially if we're talking about an interface implementation. I said so earlier, I have to check like 5 implementations and then decide what the contract might be. So I think they have high cost to write them. It's not that easy. You have to sit down and think about how to write an unambiguous comment describing what's going on. And that also means there's considerable maintenance work, because if you change them, then you have to look at these detailed comments and try to check whether they're still true and have to update them. And as I said, when they're wrong, it's confusing. And usually they can be hidden. And I don't do that, but I understand people who do that. Just fold them all by default in your IDE, and when you want to know, you just press whatever you have to do in Eclipse. Maybe you have a second small window open that shows you the comment of the method you're currently on, so that there are different ways. Looking at the benefits, I think, yes, they do explain what happens, which is not that important, but they keep abstractions intact. These are like, that's why I love them. I can just look at the code, know what it does, and don't have to go into the code and leave whatever I'm doing right now. And they can help with this top-down versus bottom-up. So how do they fare? I think it's complicated. Or I should have written it depends. That's even better. It depends, because then I can just get away with everything. But I'm going to tell you what it depends on. I mean, obviously, the costs are high if I want to change the code often. I wrote a detailed comment, and then every other day, I update a detailed comment. That takes a lot of time. And the risk is high that I stop doing it at some point. On the other hand, it's really high benefit if that code is read a lot. If I write some code that changes on a daily basis for a customer requirement, and it's like right up there with where just basically only shown to the UI or something, then there's not much code depending on that. So that it's not going to be read very often. But if I write like a basic API, like how, for example, well, everybody has string utils, so that would be an example. Or if you're writing a facade for an API that you're using, then it makes sense to think about how often is this going to be read. And if it's often, then it makes sense. So the more stable and reused code is, the better this outcome is of this, and the more sense it makes to look at these. Okay. What does it do? What does it promise? How does it work? Obviously, it's not all of that. There's more in the comment, but this is the interesting part. When keys are comparable, this class may use comparison order among keys to help break ties. Cool. As a user, that suffices. But what if I want to like work with that code? Maybe it would be nice to know how it does that. Oh, look at that. It's in there. So the hash map comment actually describes how it does that. It goes into a little bit more detail without covering all the implementation stuff to too low level so that it disturbs normal reading, but it really helps like, if you want to deal with that class to look at that. So I think this provides like a technical context. What is the thing that is going on there? What is the code for? How is it implemented? Like not going to every kind of detail, but like give a better idea. Maybe when to use it and when not to use it. And these are often these non-Javadoc blocks. You will find them, especially in JDK, quite often. Like the class begins, maybe even the method, and then you have like the /1* kind of multi-line comment, and it's often in there. Since Java 8, there have been these unofficial annotations of rpnode and impl-node. You can put them in your Javadoc, and they basically serve the same idea. rpnode will tell you random stuff about the API that is not part of the contract, and impl-node will tell you random stuff about the implementation. It's important not to confuse this with a contract. So when you say that, when we go back here, this is part of the contract. I mean, okay, it says may, so it's not really a strict contract, but anyway. that it does it like this is totally random and can change any point in time. So it's important not to confuse them. So back again, and these things slowly shift. It's not that important that are so up to date anymore. They should be fairly up to date, but the risk is not that high because I'm not reading them with the mindset of this is true. I'm more reading them with the mindset of this is an information you might need. So it's not that bad if it's not totally up to date. And usually the location is not that important. It summarizes stuff that happens, so it's usually on a high level, like as I said at the beginning of the class, for example. What you can do to find out what code is used for, you can look at demos, if you have any, or you can look at existing code, which is something that I'm often forced to do, right? There's this API, and I feel like I have an idea like what it could be used for, but let's look at the use cases to see what it actually does. And this is really hard because then you have to build, as I said, from the bottom up, you have to build this understanding, and you don't know whether half of that API usage, maybe even not how it was supposed to be used, or it's outdated. So if you're in your own code base, only rely on how is this used, you might not always get the best idea of what the code is actually supposed to be used. So costs, yeah, you gotta write them. You don't have to maintain them so much, and they can confuse you, but not that, as I said, the different mindset. Again, they can be hidden. They do explain what happens. They might keep exception up, but I think the most important part is this intent, like why is it like this? They can help you with that. So I think they're a clear winner. The costs are not that high and the benefits are considerable. It's just, what I just showed you is just 5 lines of comment in the map, and it touches on so many things that in so many places inside that map happens. They have this inner classes that have to implement this. If there is a comparable, then I have to turn into a tree node, all that kind of thing. And you get all that information with just like 5 lines. And this is the last and favorite kind of comment. Why? That's perfectly nice code, right? It's clean, it says what happens. Obviously, we're trying to pick a random color, and we're trying to avoid white colors. Why? Turns out, we're selecting user colors, and we're working for customers in China a lot, and they don't like white that much, because it's color of mourning, so they want to avoid that. That might have taken a time to come up with that. And if this is the reason for a bug, for example, you might be really like this, for example, while true and then loop, and then somebody finds out, well, whitish is actually half the color space, so it takes too long to evaluate this method, and then why is it even there? Can we kick it? Can we take it out? And then you'll be like, why don't you just check the commit messages? I would like to, and I do, but turns out that the indentation changed, and this was refactored into its own method, and there have been like 20 commits on this line of code, since the line of code that actually introduced this feature in issue 1534. So this might be hidden under a lot of other changes. I call them historical context comments because they give you context about the history of this line, why is it there? And it clarifies why these things are there, because you always have an idea of how this is supposed to be solved. You think that's easy, why is this code so complicated? Everybody is stupid, just me can write, I'm the only one who can write proper code. Because you don't know all of these edge cases. You haven't written the code, haven't dealt with all these complexities, but the author did. And if you leave some breadcrumbs, you can actually kind of come to the same conclusion maybe. And you can do something which is totally impossible with all the other things. You can document the paths that you did not take. I decided we first thought about this, but it didn't work. So we decided on the other thing. That's great, because when I'm coming by, I'm like, why didn't you just do this? It's so much easier. And I think they fare even better than the other ones. So they don't have to be up to date at all. It's just a historical thing, right? It's always true. It's like commit messages. You don't update commit messages. They are true for that point in time. And they can be wherever they want. And as I said, commit messages are a good alternative. And I don't want to bore you even more with this cost, so let's say they're not that high, right? Especially maintenance gets off the picture because you just delete it when they're not valid anymore, and even if they're in there, they're not going to confuse anyone much. And it's not that hard to write them. Just say, you don't have to define a contract, you don't have to be overly precise, you can just be like, look, this is how we did it, because reasons. So I think they're even better. Context comments are even better than the other ones. Costs are negligible, there are considerable benefits. And when you ever have to hunt down a bug or decide on how to implement a new feature, these are just great breadcrumbs to find, to be like, oh, this is why. Okay, now I can see that. Now I can adapt to that information. Okay, so we have this kind of comments, and I ranted about why writing no comments is stupid. So, but where does this leave us? What could be a takeaway? And I think that's really important. Like, these all comments are failure. This idea, which I took a little bit of context, Uncle Bob wrote a bit more about that, but that's the basic idea. I think that's just wrong. Comments are a tool, and they can help you understand the code. And you can use them, but do it wisely, because they do have costs, of course, they do have downsides. But they are a tool that is worth using, and not saying that it's always wrong. So I'm proposing this idea of like writing clean comments. Because comments as code are for me a part of a clean code base. So I think if you write an individual comment, for me it's important that I can see what kind of comment are you writing. Is this a contract? I just like random information. Like, I don't want to confuse these. So I think that would be nice to make that obvious. In Java, it's not that hard. You can use the Java doc for contracts. You can use inline comments for narrations. You can use these other multi-line comments for the context comments. I think it's easy to use different forms of comments, but you have to know, and the team has to know what you mean by that, of course. If you write a comment, put yourself in your reader's mind. It's very easy to just write a comment the way that you write the code, which is not that helpful because maybe the comment is supposed to give the reader a different point of view. So it makes sense to think like, how would someone look at this code who didn't just write it? Strive to make that as local as possible. Whenever you write something, don't be like, oh yeah, 5 classes over there, then this is going to happen, so this is why I react here this way. This might, first of all, might show that the design is not optimal, but try to keep it local so it's easier to update them. And get them reviewed. You do code reviews, you do pair programming. This is part of that. Like, are the comments, do they help? Don't just ignore them during these processes. So in general, this is my proposal. My personal proposal. We'll look at how a team might look at that differently in a moment. I think don't use narrations. They don't make a lot of sense. Unless it's absolutely necessary, totally forgo them. On each class, please have just one Java doc contract comment that says, look, this is a map, it maps keys to values. And like 2 other sentences that explain like the basic abstraction of what's going on. Because if you're not writing JDK code, then maybe your code is not that reusable, like map. Map is a general concept, you can use it everywhere, there's not that much context, but most of the time you're writing, I don't know, like an order line item, and it would be great to see like an order line item covers a single item that was ordered. It's usually part of an order, and I don't know. That might basically already be it. But often there's more in context to what is around that, and I think it makes sense to have them. Then if you realize that an API is going to be reused, what you're just writing, you're not writing that just for your own consumption, you're writing something that other people will use. And think hard about that because people will use as much as possible. Add contracts, and it helps them reuse your code. It helps them find the code, helps them understand it and use it, as opposed to, I didn't find it, or maybe they found it and didn't know it was solving that problem, so I didn't look closely at it. So if you think that something might be reused, consider writing a contract, especially for those things that aren't obvious. And contract doesn't mean you have to write the full Java doc block and comment the parameter user with this is the user. That doesn't make sense. Just leave it out. If there's no information to add, leave it out. But if you say this is a user, and unlike everything else in my APIs, it might actually be null, right? A user, nullable. That will already be it. Just to provide those information that are not immediately obvious. Anything that I have to look into the code to understand could possibly be part of a contract if it's worth it because it's reused. And I think context always wins. I write a lot more than many of the people I work with, and I still feel like I write too little. I write like, I don't know, maybe once a day I write one of these blocks saying we did this decision because of this and that. There should be more, I think, because that's our daily work, deciding this against that, how are we going to do this. And at some point someone is going to come back and look at it and wants to know why. But the details depend on a lot of different things. If you have a big team, then knowledge goes around slower. If you have like a small 3-person team and you do pair programming and code reviews, then everybody knows everything. So there's less need to have comments. If you have a big team, and it takes a while before some developer comes back to the same code, it has more. There's more benefit in that to have a comment then. The technical backgrounds are important. If everybody in your team is like an expert Java developer and you're just doing Java, there's way less need to document things than if you have very high variety of people with different backgrounds, and they might not be privy to all the details in your language, or to how things are typically solved in your language, not only about the syntax, but also about how is the Java problem typically solved. Because yes, there has to be a factory because it's Java, so if there's a JavaScript developer, you might think like, why do I have a factory for everything? No, that might make more sense to have those comments in there then. I think code base size is very important. Like if you have a huge code base, especially if it's old, or if you write something that you hope is going to be old at some point, then those people down the line really curse you for reading code that you're not there anymore to explain. Nobody knows it. It says like test coverage of 50%, and they will hate you for it. And there's a saying, and I didn't find the quote. It's like you should always comment your code like the next guy who's sitting on it is like a psycho who knows where you're living. So something along those lines. So that makes sense to think about your fellow humans who are going to look at your code and wonder, maybe they need more information. Do you have code ownership? Surprisingly, if you do, you might need less comments, because if you have like a huge code base, but only these 3 people are allowed to touch this part of the code, which I think is not generally a good idea, but if you do that, then you might need less comments than if everybody basically works on everything. So finally, what I think every team should do, they should get together and speak about comments, and in a way that is not prejudiced along these lines of what you want comments, then you're just not elite enough, because that is how this usually works. If you want comments, and you just don't know clean code well enough, and you're just a stupid developer, and that doesn't make sense. That is not a way to have an open discussion about this, and it's also very far from the truth. And also, in my personal experience, means that usually the developers saying that are the ones that never wanted to write comments. They hated it all the time. Now they have a reason, and they may be writing clean code. They may not be. It's just a random selection of coders who never wanted to write comments. Now they're all claiming my code is awesome. I don't need comments anymore. So it's important to be able to talk about this freely, saying like, yes, they have costs, and it doesn't make sense to just comment everything, but they do have benefits, and where might we need them? And I think that makes the most sense when you just go through the code base. You just look at your code base, go through it, and say, with concrete examples, look, I did this, and there was no comment, and it took me an hour longer than it should have. Or I went through this, I found this comment, it was wrong. Like, it totally confused me, and I spent too much time. Or I got into this class, it has this explanation, it was awesome. I knew immediately what to do. Try to find these examples in your code base and think about whether my categorization, my taxonomy of comments is maybe off or wrong, and you have different kind of comments. And try to find out which makes sense for you and which don't. And then, and that's the most important part, you have to get everybody to agree. And it's also the hardest part, maybe, because it doesn't make sense if half of the people decide that comments are important to them and they're going to write some. One guy is just going to narrate every single line, and half of the team is just not caring at all. So what you get then is exactly this position where you have comments, some of them are useless, most of them are wrong, and that doesn't get you anywhere. If you cannot settle on a common approach, well then, unfortunately, I think the best thing is to just don't write any comments at all, because then they get easily outdated. And don't just agree on that, put it someplace. Say we have a team style guide, or you have review, a guide to what things are part of your review. Put it in there. Like, decide on how are we going to make sure this happens, how are we going to enforce this, and how are we going to adapt to changes, because there will be changes. At some point you will realize, well, this was too much commenting, or too little, or generally skewed in the wrong way. And to fix this, use a feedback cycle, like maybe code reviews or pair programming, to come up with like what's right for you. Okay, that was that. You can find me here where I blog, and here on Twitter, and here on Google+. And now we have like 5 minutes for questions. So I guess there won't be any, because I convinced all of you? No. Okay, so the people saying no. Why no?
So basically, I agree with first sentence.
Okay.
I agree on the comments with public API, because this is like because I prefer Parlog, and you just don't want to dive into how to name. And I agree on the inobvious intentions and comment for the inobvious intentions when they are complicated and you cannot wrap it in the Parlog table and descriptive name. And on other stuff, there are better approaches for me, like which, for example, this example with the big operator, it can be easily wrapped in the descriptive and Parlog table name with a clear intention.
Okay, let me repeat that. So, so what you said is 2% are okay, and the 2% were the idea about documenting intent and about the public API. And the public API, I think, is very interesting because that's also what Uncle Bob wrote in clean code, that public APIs are okay. The project I'm working on has almost no public API. It's 1.5 million lines of code, it's 15 years old, and we have huge amounts of internal APIs. And they could just as well be called some other fruit than guava and be that kind of API. So there's really, in those cases, no difference whether it's public or not. It's an API that's supposed to be reused, and it is reused throughout the whole code base. You can't refactor anything without touching like 100 files, which is good. It means that they solved a problem and they are reused. If that's the case, then you have little chance to change their meaning anyway. Because if they're used like, if you have a method and it's used like in 50 different places in your code base, you cannot just go, oh, I know that I should do this differently, just change the meanings. So refactoring that method is really unlikely. That means that maintenance cost, I mean, not internal refactoring, I don't mean that. I mean like changing the meaning of the method is really unlikely. Which means that maintenance cost for comments on this method drop to 0 because you're not going to change it anyway. But if you write a comment on that method, then it helps people use it regardless of whether it's public or not. I mean, this is the whole distinction between what does a public even mean? What if we have like an internal project that creates utility methods or classes? Is it public? I mean, it's not open source, we're not putting it out there, so it's not public, but still an API. So I think that distinction between public and non-public just makes no sense at all. How much is it reused? If it's a lot, comment it. If it's not, don't. The bitwise operator, you said you would say you should put in a descriptive method name, and I think you're right in that case. I left it in there. It's hard to come up with examples for these arcane language features. I don't use them on purpose, so I usually have very little use for those comments, but I know that they are there. So sometimes it might be useful, but in general it's like very rarely ever.
Like regular expressions.
Yeah, that's a good example. Regular expressions. I mean, you could cover that with tests as well, but when I write regular expressions, I do write that on top, like, this is what I want this to look like. Like, this is a matching string. I just write then above that line. I mean, I have tests for all kinds of different things, but just to give me an idea of what I'm looking at, because I can never read regular expressions. Good example, thank you. Flexible API, you totally lost me. Mm-hmm. About the human, if you write, you mean like fluent APIs that go like very readable. I mean, if it's going to be reused, it's going to have pre and post conditions. It has to be, there are usually corner cases in there. If you find one comment, if there's no corner case, it's just, I mean, set user is a bad example, but say set user just sets the user. Don't write a comment, even if that method is used everywhere in your code base. There's no reason for that, because it's so clear. And sometimes code is like that, and it should be like that. And if it is, don't comment it. But often it's like, the user you give me cannot be below 18 because he's going to drink in this bar. That should be going in the comment. Even if it's called visit bar, it should still be in there saying like, look, I don't take underage people into my bar. It should also be a test for that. Comment helps a lot. Did that answer the question? Okay. Yes? Hmm? Yeah. So the question was, maybe that's not the best method name. Maybe is it offensive might have been better. And true, like we can argue, like if I put up a code example there, we will argue to no end about whether there will be a better method name. And most likely there will be. But that doesn't mean that it covers all the cases. Even if it is offensive, it's better than this, I give you that, but offensive to whom? And still saying that, look, there's an issue because maybe there was a customer discussion, a long discussion with a customer, and just this line gives me the ability to look it up and be like coming back to that, because again, line by line commits, they get lost easily if you have a lot of different changes that do not functionally change the code, like refactorings and moving code around, buries all of that information, and you're not going to find it easily. And I don't like putting issue links all over the code, but in some cases where, like, especially when there have been discussions with product management, external information, I like to include them. Okay, we're out of time, unfortunately. If you want to scream at me because I'm stupid, come up here. And otherwise, have a nice conference. Thank you.